If you've ignored creatine because you thought it was just for muscle, I get it. I did too. I knew about it, my patients asked me about it, and I knew people in the fitness and longevity space loved it, but it just never felt like one of the most important supplements for the women that I was thinking about. But the more I've thought about what burnout actually feels like for myself and for other women, the more I think creatine may have been sitting in the wrong category this whole time. Hi, I'm Jess. I'm a clinical nutritionist, and I talk a lot on this channel about women's mood, energy, hormones, and the deeper physiology behind why so many women feel off. And today, I want to talk about creatine, not as a gym supplement, but as something I think may be more relevant to burnout women than a lot of us realize. So let's first start with, why did I ignore creatine for so long? Yes, there are plenty of women who are into gym gains, performance, body composition, and all of that, which there's nothing wrong with. But most of the women that I talk to aren't sitting around wondering if they need creatine for muscles. They're wondering why they feel mentally drained, why their workouts or busy days wipe them out, and why they're so fragile under stress and their body just doesn't bounce back the way that it used to. And that's probably why I deprioritized it too. After a decade in functional medicine, I can tell you there's always a trending topic and then a wave of supplements that rise up around it. Lately, that has been a lot of longevity, performance gains, and optimization for long-term health. So it's not that I thought creatine was bad or useless, it's just that it lived in that category of maybe helpful, but probably not one of the most important things, because I'm not someone who likes promoting or personally taking giant supplement stacks. So it just never felt high enough on the priority list compared to everything else that I was focused on. So I guess the next question is, how did that change for me, and why am I changing my perspective now? Well, some of you may know that one of my biggest both physical and mental health struggles has been fatigue, burnout, and burnout cycles. And when things get really bad, I'm always experimenting with anything that might support me a little more. I first started using creatine as part of what I call my fatigue fighter formula, which is right here, because in my luteal phase especially, fatigue tends to hit me a lot harder. So I started adding creatine into this drink I was making that I make with electrolytes, D-ribose, which I'm not going to get into in this video, and a little apple cider vinegar, just as something supportive I could drink more regularly. And because I did notice overall positive benefits, I started using it more consistently, not in some dramatic overnight way or in a way where I suddenly became like a creatine hype girl, but enough that over the last couple of years, I've slowly worked up to using it more and more. At this point, I still don't take it every single day, but I think about it much more supportively now, especially around anything that feels depleting. So if I'm going to hot yoga, if I'm going to the gym, or doing something that I know is going to take more out of me, I almost always put creatine into my electrolytes. And the longer I experimented with that, especially comparing it to times where I ran out or I didn't add it to it just because I forgot, the more I really felt like it was making a difference in how drained I felt after these activities. It's hard to explain unless you also deal with this kind of fatigue. Maybe if you're watching this video, you do, but there's a certain level of exhaustion that can feel like it hits your bones. Like by the afternoon, your system is just done. And I started noticing, particularly in my luteal phase, that I was getting less of that when I was using the creatine more regularly, or it just helps me push through a little bit more. And for me, that matters even more because My fatigue is very directly tied to my mood. The more exhausted I am, the more depressed I tend to feel. So anything that helps me feel a little less drained and a little less like I'm running on empty gets my attention. Then, the more I paid attention, the more I realized I was hearing a lot of similar themes in the women that I work with too. So I've started using creatine a little bit more thoughtfully in some of my protocols. And while I still think it's too early to make huge claims or act as if it's the answer for everyone, I do want to talk about why creatine may do a lot more than just support muscle and what we actually know about it when we look at it through an energy lens. So yes, the strongest evidence is still around creatine monohydrate for increasing energy stores, which is why it's so well known for exercise performance and recovery. But there's also a growing body of literature looking at creatine beyond athletics, especially for cognitive function, brain energetics, and mental fatigue. For women specifically, there is some published literature arguing that creatine may be relevant across female life stages, not just for exercise, but also potentially for things like cognition, mood, hydration, and recovery-related outcomes. What stood out to me is that women may actually differ in creatine biology, with some reports showing lower creatine synthesis and lower dietary intake on average. This research also looked at cellular hydration and fluid shifts across the menstrual cycle, especially in the luteal phase, super cool, along with possible effects on sleep, brain energy, and emotional resilience. Furthermore, in life stages like perimenopause, where fatigue, brain fog, mood changes, muscle loss, and bone changes can all start colliding, creatine is being discussed as potentially a helpful tool for supporting that transition. It's a pretty cool study. I'll link it below if you want to check it out. So the short version is that creatine helps support rapid energy availability in the body. We usually hear about that in muscle, but the brain is really energy demanding too. It doesn't mean it's a magic fix, but it does mean that it may be more relevant to some of the symptoms that can show up when someone feels burnt out, depleted, or like they're running on low battery. Creatine is also being studied in depression and mood, although the outcomes there are still really mixed. And I think that's important to say clearly because I do not want to oversell creatine or make it sound like it's some kind of mood treatment. Mood is very nuanced. There are so many things that can contribute to feeling depressed, flat, or emotionally off. But what I do think is interesting is that creatine may be relevant to some of the low energy, low reserved, mentally drained physiology that often overlaps with mood struggles. And like I mentioned previously, that is exactly how it feels for me a lot of the time. Some of my lower mood states don't really feel emotional or situational so much as they feel like a sense of depletion. So no, I would not frame creatine as the answer for all mood issues, but I do think it may be relevant for one piece of the picture for some women, especially in the luteal phase. So who I think this is for is based off of my personal experience and clinical experience. Please always talk to your healthcare provider regarding these questions and decisions, but I think it makes the most sense for women who feel chronically depleted, who are not just tired, but mentally drained, who feel like their recovery is poor, their reserve is low, or their body just doesn't bounce back the way it used to. I think it's especially interesting for women who are doing a lot of things right. Maybe they're exercising regularly, they're eating pretty well, maybe they're trying to support themselves, but they still feel underpowered. It may also be worth thinking about for women who notice certain phases of their cycle hit them harder, especially if fatigue, brain fog, or that low battery feeling tends to ramp up in the luteal phase. And then, of course, I think it becomes especially interesting in life stages like perimenopause, where there are a lot of these symptoms stacking up, as mentioned in the study. Now, in terms of practical questions, the form with the best evidence behind everything we're talking about today is still plain creatine monohydrate. As far as dosing, I can't tell you what's going to be right for you, but you might hear people talk about a loading dose. That mostly comes from the exercise world, where the point is to saturate muscle creatine stores quickly. You can also gradually work up to similar tissue saturation over a few weeks with a more standard dose, which is generally 3 to 5 grams or 3 to 5 grams a day. It's also worth noting that higher doses, especially loading doses, are more likely to be where people notice side effects like GI discomfort, diarrhea, bloating, or water retention. You may also hear people talk about creatine cycling, and that idea mostly comes from older gym culture as well and supplement habits, but in terms of what actually seems to matter is more about consistency than cycling on and off. I don't think that there's strong evidence-based reasons where most healthy people would need to cycle it, especially if they are just using basic daily creatine monohydrate. The bigger practical caveat is that if you have kidney disease, impaired kidney function, or anything medically complex going on, then it's definitely something to run by your clinician first. And one last practical note on brands. Creatine monohydrate is fairly standardized. So because creatine is trending right now, you are probably going to see a lot of brands like making it look fancy, maybe adding extra ingredients or packaging it like it's something wildly different. But honestly, the main thing you need to know is that if it's plain creatine monohydrate from a reputable brand that you trust, you're probably good. I would get powder over capsules because you'll need to take a ton of capsules otherwise. So like I said, a normal dose is 3 to 5 grams. That's a lot to fit into capsules, and it's a lot of the reasons why people normally take creatine as part of the drink, as part of their electrolytes, or like in this cocktail like I have here. I do not have one magical brand that I think everyone needs. This is not sponsored, and I'm not affiliated with a creatine brand. I've used several over time. Usually when it comes to something this standardized, I make my decision based on brands I already trust and who has the best value. Right now, I'm using the Designs for Health creatine monohydrate, so I will link that below as an example in case that's helpful. And honestly, if you are dealing with low energy, poor recovery, and that constantly drained feeling, I'd watch this video next on the eating habits that may be draining your energy, because that piece is incredibly foundational and may matter, if not just as much, even more than any supplement add-on. So hopefully, if you haven't seen it already, I'll see you in that one.